In the early months of 1914, Europe was a continent poised on the brink of upheaval. Political tensions, complex alliances, and an arms race among nations created a volatile environment, one in which a single spark could ignite a major conflict. That spark arrived on June 28, 1914, when Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary was assassinated in Sarajevo by Gavrilo Princip, a Bosnian Serb nationalist. While the assassination itself was a targeted act against Austria-Hungary, its consequences rippled across the continent. Austria-Hungary issued an ultimatum to Serbia, demanding strict compliance with a series of conditions. Serbia's partial acceptance of the ultimatum did little to appease Austria-Hungary, and within weeks, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. The assassination and the ensuing diplomatic fallout were only the immediate triggers. Europe at that time was already a powder keg due to an intricate web of alliances, rising nationalism, colonial rivalries, and militarism. Germany and Austria-Hungary, bound by the dual alliance, prepared for swift military action. Meanwhile, Serbia looked to Russia for protection, activating the defensive alliances that bound European powers together. As Germany enacted the Schlieffen Plan, a strategy aimed at quickly defeating France by advancing through Belgium, Britain found itself drawn into the conflict, leading to declarations of war across the continent. Within weeks, what might have been a regional skirmish had transformed into a full-scale continental war, laying the foundation for what history would later call World War I. The war saw Europe divided into two major coalitions, the Central Powers and the Allied Powers. The Central Powers consisted of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and later the Ottoman Empire and Bulgaria. The Allied Powers were initially composed of France, Russia, and Britain, with Italy joining in 1915 after switching sides from the Triple Alliance. These alliances, while intended to provide security and maintain balance of power, ultimately created a domino effect. The mobilization of one country prompted mobilization in allied nations, escalating a regional conflict into a global war. Germany's military strategy, particularly the Schlieffen Plan, played a pivotal role in shaping the early trajectory of the war. The plan involved a rapid invasion of France through Belgium, intended to avoid a prolonged two-front war with France and Russia simultaneously. However, the violation of Belgian neutrality provoked Britain, leading it to declare war on Germany. The result was a complex multi-front conflict that would last 4 years and redefine modern warfare. During this initial period, the United States, under President Woodrow Wilson, adopted a policy of neutrality. The U.S. government aimed to avoid entanglement in a foreign war that did not directly threaten national security. American public opinion at the time largely supported this neutral stance. The majority of the population, influenced by the distance of the conflict and the country's traditions of isolationism, preferred that the United States focus on domestic economic growth and political stability rather than European entanglements. Despite its official neutrality, the United States was indirectly involved in the conflict through economic and financial activities. American banks, businesses, and manufacturers provided significant loans, supplies, and raw materials to the Allied powers, including Britain and France. These included foodstuffs, industrial goods, munitions, and other critical resources. Although these exchanges were commercially motivated, they gradually aligned U.S. economic interests with the success of the Allies. Neutrality, therefore, was nuanced, politically non-aligned, but increasingly invested economically in the Allied war effort. Domestic considerations further complicated America's neutral position. The U.S. population included substantial German-American and Irish-American communities, each with distinct perspectives on the war. German Americans often felt cultural and familial ties to Germany, whereas Irish Americans tended to oppose Britain due to historical grievances. Balancing these domestic sensitivities required careful diplomacy and political strategy. President Wilson and his administration had to navigate these internal divisions to maintain public support for neutrality, at least in the early years of the war. In addition to domestic and economic factors, technological developments in warfare posed new challenges to neutrality. Germany's use of unrestricted submarine warfare in 1915, intended to counter British naval blockades, resulted in attacks on neutral ships, including American merchant vessels. These attacks strained diplomatic relations and began to challenge the practical limits of U.S. neutrality. America's entry into the war, the Lusitania and Zimmermann telegram. By 1915, World War I had evolved into a brutal, entrenched conflict. Europe was engulfed in unprecedented levels of violence, with millions of soldiers and civilians affected by battles that stretched across France, Belgium, Russia, and other fronts. The United States, though officially neutral, was becoming increasingly aware that the distant European war could no longer be observed from a comfortable distance. Economic, political, and military developments were steadily eroding the foundation of U.S. neutrality. Two key events, the sinking of the Lusitania and the interception of the Zimmermann telegram, would serve as turning points in America's transition from observer to active participant. The RMS Lusitania, a British ocean liner, became a symbol of the vulnerability of neutral citizens in a global conflict. On May 7, 1915, the Lusitania was torpedoed by a German U-boat off the coast of Ireland. The attack was part of Germany's broader strategy of unrestricted submarine warfare, intended to blockade Britain and restrict the flow of supplies and reinforcements. The sinking of the Lusitania resulted in the deaths of nearly 1,200 passengers, including 128 Americans. The tragic loss of life created shockwaves across the United States, where public opinion began to shift from neutral observation to active concern about Germany's wartime tactics. The Lusitania incident was not an isolated act of aggression, but a deliberate part of Germany's strategy. By targeting ships that carried military supplies to Britain, Germany intended to weaken the Allied war effort. However, the inclusion of civilian passengers among the casualties, particularly Americans, escalated diplomatic tensions. President Woodrow Wilson, while condemning the attack, initially sought to maintain neutrality through diplomatic channels, demanding that Germany respect the rights of neutral nations. Wilson's administration faced a delicate balancing act: the need to protect American citizens and assert moral authority while avoiding premature entry into a European war that many Americans were reluctant to join. Public reaction to the Lusitania disaster was intense and multifaceted. Newspapers extensively reported the tragedy, portraying it as an attack on innocent civilians and an affront to international law. The incident intensified anti-German sentiment and led to calls for the U.S. government to adopt a more assertive stance. Pro-war voices argued that America could no longer remain neutral in the face of attacks on its citizens and interests, while proponents of continued neutrality cautioned against involvement in what was seen as a distant and complex conflict. Despite the public outrage, Wilson's administration initially maintained a cautious approach. He issued stern warnings to Germany, emphasizing that attacks on neutral shipping were unacceptable and threatening to sever diplomatic relations if they continued. Germany, wary of provoking an American military response, temporarily curtailed unrestricted submarine warfare. The Lusitania, therefore, became both a symbol of the perils of modern warfare and a diplomatic turning point, demonstrating that U.S. neutrality was under increasing strain. 2 years later, in January 1917, the Zimmermann telegram further accelerated America's path toward war. This secret communication, sent by German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann to the German ambassador in Mexico, proposed a military alliance between Germany and Mexico should the United States enter the conflict against Germany. In exchange, Germany promised to support Mexico in reclaiming lost territories, including Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. British intelligence intercepted the telegram and shared it with the U.S. government, creating a sensation that dramatically shifted public opinion. The Zimmermann telegram represented a direct challenge to U.S. sovereignty. Unlike previous provocations, which primarily affected Americans abroad, this message explicitly encouraged military action against the United States. The revelation of Germany's plan to involve Mexico in hostilities was perceived as a direct threat to national security and territorial integrity. American newspapers quickly published the contents of the telegram, generating widespread outrage and strengthening calls for a decisive response. The combined impact of the Lusitania sinking and the Zimmermann telegram created an environment in which neutrality became increasingly untenable. While economic ties and cultural connections had gradually drawn the United States toward the Allies, these events provided clear and immediate reasons for the country to enter the war. Public sentiment shifted rapidly, with citizens, politicians, and military leaders recognizing that a purely neutral stance could no longer protect American interests or citizens from foreign aggression. At 6 Doughboys and America's contribution. When the United States officially entered World War I in April 1917, the Allied forces were already fatigued from 3 years of grueling combat. Trench warfare had devastated Western Europe, leaving soldiers exhausted, supplies dwindling, and morale fluctuating. In this context, the arrival of fresh American forces provided both practical support and a psychological boost to Allied operations. These soldiers, famously nicknamed the Doughboys, represented not only manpower but also the industrial and logistical might of a nation now fully mobilized for war. The term doughboy has uncertain origins, though it became widely associated with American infantrymen during the war. Some historians suggest the nickname arose from the white clay or dough used to polish buttons on soldiers' uniforms, while others attribute it to the flour dumplings consumed by troops during earlier conflicts. Regardless of its origin, the Doughboys quickly became synonymous with American participation and resilience on the battlefield. Unlike the battle-hardened European soldiers who had endured years of combat, the American forces arrived with comparatively high morale and physical readiness, offering a new dimension to the Allied strategy. The U.S. military faced immediate logistical challenges in deploying troops across the Atlantic. Transporting hundreds of thousands of soldiers to European ports required coordination on an unprecedented scale. Convoys of troop ships, often escorted by naval vessels, braved German U-boat threats to ensure that men arrived safely at ports in France and Belgium. Once ashore, the soldiers underwent additional training to adapt to trench warfare, artillery bombardments, and chemical attacks, elements that had already defined the grim nature of European battlefields. American industrial and agricultural production became a cornerstone of the war effort, extending the country's contribution far beyond the battlefield. Factories ramped up production of rifles, artillery shells, uniforms, and other military equipment. Mines and steel plants operated at full capacity to meet the demand for war materials, while agricultural sectors ensured that both domestic and Allied needs for food were met. This industrial mobilization allowed the United States to supply not only its own forces, but also Allied armies, significantly alleviating shortages caused by years of sustained warfare. Medical support was another critical aspect of America's contribution. The U.S. sent extensive medical supplies, including bandages, surgical instruments, and medicines, to support the Allied troops. American doctors and nurses were also deployed to frontline hospitals, providing care under challenging conditions. Their presence helped reduce casualties, improve recovery rates, and maintain the overall effectiveness of Allied forces. The integration of American medical personnel exemplified the broader strategy of combining manpower with specialized skills to reinforce the war effort. Beyond logistics and frontline combat, the United States played a vital role in strengthening morale and organization within the Allied forces. American troops brought fresh energy and a sense of optimism to battlefields where soldiers had endured prolonged trench warfare. Their arrival coincided with critical military operations, and their participation often tipped the balance in key engagements. The presence of well-supplied, motivated American soldiers provided both tangible and psychological support to European allies, demonstrating that the war's outcome could still be influenced by strategic timing and reinforcements. One notable area of impact was artillery and offensive operations. American forces, supported by modern equipment and coordinated strategies, participated in significant offensives that aimed to break entrenched German positions. Their involvement required careful integration with French and British units, highlighting the challenges of multinational coordination during large-scale warfare. Nevertheless, American troops adapted quickly, contributing to successful operations and demonstrating the strategic importance of fresh forces in a conflict that had been stagnant for years. In addition to combat roles, American soldiers were involved in logistics, engineering, and communications. They helped construct roads, bridges, and supply depots, which were essential for sustaining military operations. Communication networks, including telephone and telegraph lines, were maintained and expanded by American units, ensuring that Allied commands could coordinate complex maneuvers across extended front lines. These contributions, though less visible than direct combat, were crucial in maintaining operational efficiency and supporting strategic objectives. The influx of American troops also had a broader influence on the conduct of the war. Their presence allowed Allied commanders greater flexibility in planning offensives, as exhausted European units could be rotated or reinforced without weakening the front. The Doughboys' adaptability, combined with U.S. logistical and industrial support, helped shift the dynamics of the war in favor of the Allies. While individual battles remained costly and chaotic, the overall strategic position improved markedly with America's active involvement. Economic support, though partially addressed in previous chapters, had a direct connection to troop effectiveness on the front lines. American loans and material supplies ensured that Allied units received necessary equipment, from rifles and machine guns to food rations and clothing. The combination of material support and troop reinforcement created a multiplier effect. Soldiers were better fed, better armed, and better equipped, which in turn increased their combat readiness and morale. The broader social and cultural impact of American involvement is also noteworthy. The arrival of U.S. troops exposed European forces and civilians to new military culture, organizational methods, and societal values. The Doughboys brought with them not only military discipline, but also innovations in logistics, training, and medical care. These contributions had long-term effects, influencing post-war military structures and setting the stage for future cooperation in global conflicts. In summary, America's contribution to World War I extended far beyond simply sending soldiers to the front. The Doughboys represented a combination of manpower, strategic support, and morale that reinvigorated Allied operations. Industrial production ensured that material shortages did not cripple the Allied forces, while medical, engineering, and logistical support enhanced battlefield efficiency. The integration of these elements showcased a comprehensive national mobilization effort, where every sector of American society played a role in supporting the war effort. The Doughboys and the broader American contribution played a pivotal role in sustaining Allied resistance during a critical phase of the war. Their arrival marked a turning point in both morale and operational capacity, demonstrating that the United States was capable of projecting power and influence far beyond its borders. Unlike earlier periods, when neutrality limited American involvement, 1917 and 1918 saw the United States fully engaged in shaping the course and eventual outcome of World War I. In conclusion, the U.S. contribution through its soldiers, logistical support, industrial production, and medical services exemplified the comprehensive nature of modern warfare. The arrival of the Doughboys, their integration with Allied forces, and the strategic use of American resources collectively enhanced the effectiveness of the war effort. While European forces had endured years of grueling combat, the American entry provided a decisive infusion of energy, resources, and organizational capacity that ultimately contributed to the Allied victory. War's end and America's role in peace. By the autumn of 1918, the First World War had raged for over 4 years, leaving Europe exhausted and destabilized. Military stalemates, resource shortages, and widespread social upheaval had pushed the continent to a breaking point. The arrival of the United States on the battlefield in 1917 had provided fresh manpower, resources, and morale to the Allied powers, but the final phases of the conflict demanded sustained coordination and strategic planning. The final months would not only decide the outcome of the war, but also define the United States' emerging role as a global power and its influence in shaping post-war diplomacy. The decisive military campaigns of late 1918 showcased the strategic impact of American forces. After joining the Allied operations, the U.S. military contributed to a series of offensives designed to break entrenched German positions along the Western Front. One significant operation was the Second Battle of the Marne, in which American troops played a crucial role alongside French and British units. The coordinated efforts of these forces forced the German army into retreat, reversing earlier advances and demonstrating the cumulative effect of fresh American manpower and logistical support. The military significance of the American presence extended beyond battlefield numbers. The infusion of U.S. troops allowed exhausted Allied forces to rotate and regroup, alleviating the strain on European armies that had been engaged in continuous combat for years. American units brought modern organizational methods, improved supply management, and innovative tactics that complemented existing strategies. The military significance of the American presence extended beyond battlefield numbers. The infusion of U.S. troops allowed exhausted Allied forces to rotate and regroup, alleviating the strain on European armies that had been engaged in continuous combat for years. American units brought modern organizational methods, improved supply management, and innovative tactics that complemented existing strategies. The combination of tactical contribution and psychological reinforcement amplified the overall effectiveness of Allied operations, contributing directly to Germany's diminishing capacity to sustain the war. By October 1918, the German military was facing severe shortages of manpower, munitions, and food supplies. Widespread unrest at home, combined with military defeats, undermined morale and weakened the ability of Germany to continue fighting effectively. The U.S. contribution, though only a part of the larger Allied effort, had intensified these pressures. American participation had transformed the conflict from a static, attritional war into a dynamic and coordinated push toward decisive outcomes. The end of hostilities was formally recognized on November 11, 1918, when Germany signed the Armistice Agreement. This cessation of fighting concluded 4 years of devastating combat that had claimed millions of lives, displaced entire populations, and reshaped the political landscape of Europe. For the United States, the armistice represented not just a military victory, but also a validation of the nation's role as an emerging global actor capable of influencing international affairs. Beyond the battlefield, the United States assumed a central role in shaping the post-war peace process. President Woodrow Wilson, who had articulated a vision of America as a moral and stabilizing force, took an active lead in negotiations. Wilson's 14 points, presented in January 1918, outlined principles intended to promote lasting peace, prevent future conflicts, and establish a framework for international cooperation. These points included proposals for open diplomacy, free trade, disarmament, and the self-determination of nations. While not all points were fully implemented, they provided the ideological foundation for post-war negotiations and reflected a distinctly American vision of global order. One of the most significant outcomes influenced by the United States was the conceptualization of the League of Nations, intended as an international organization to mediate disputes and prevent future wars. Wilson viewed the League as a cornerstone of his peace strategy, emphasizing collective security and cooperation among nations. Although the U.S. Senate ultimately refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles and the United States did not join the League, the effort represented a dramatic shift in American foreign policy. For the first time, the U.S. positioned itself as an active participant in the creation of global governance structures, signaling a departure from traditional isolationism. The economic and humanitarian contributions of the United States during the post-armistice period were also substantial. American industry continued to supply essential materials, food, and medical aid to war-torn regions, assisting in the stabilization of European economies and societies. Relief programs helped address food shortages, care for displaced populations, and rehabilitate infrastructure devastated by years of conflict. These efforts not only alleviated immediate suffering, but also reinforced the perception of the United States as a nation committed to international responsibility and reconstruction. In addition to diplomacy and humanitarian efforts, the United States engaged in discussions regarding the redrawing of national borders and the establishment of new states. The collapse of empires such as Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire created a complex political landscape in which ethnic, cultural, and national considerations had to be balanced. American representatives advocated for principles that would ensure the autonomy and self-determination of emerging nations, reflecting Wilson's commitment to fairness and stability. Although practical implementation varied, U.S. involvement helped shape the contours of the post-war map and influence debates on national sovereignty. The social impact of American involvement in the war was felt both abroad and domestically. In Europe, the presence of American troops in aid programs fostered goodwill and strengthened alliances, while demonstrating the country's ability to project power effectively beyond its borders. Domestically, returning soldiers faced challenges of reintegration, including the need for employment, education, and healthcare.